We've saved a seat just for you. There's always room at the table. It's Coffee with the Pastor with your host, Andy McDaniel.
Welcome everybody to Coffee with the Pastor. It is always a joy to be with you and share this hour with you each and every Monday. I want to thank you for being here with us today. I pray that what we offer, what we discuss will not only benefit you in some way, but truly point you to a stronger relationship and walk with Christ. That's our point here at Coffee with the Pastor that we always share each and every time. I am your host, Pastor Andy McDaniel. I have the honor of hosting this program now for over 1 year. Very, very excited about that. We've been able to share our hearts with you for that long. Many great conversations have taken place during that time. I want to thank you for continued prayers as we march into year 2. I've also had the honor now of pastoring West Fayetteville Baptist Church for a little over a year right here in Fayetteville, North Carolina. We'd be honored with your visit if you want to come by. If you're near the area or passing through or looking for a church home, we would love to meet you. You can come by any given Sunday or Wednesday evening. For all the details about our service times, about events, all those different things, head over to wfaybc.net for all the details. Well, each and every time we come together here at Coffee with the Pastor, it's always exciting to share our guests with you and their hearts and their journeys that they've been on. So today I'm excited to bring on a brand new guest. Welcome to the show today, Dr. Alan Solheim. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you. I
so
appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. We're excited to have you. Let everybody know a little bit about you. We always have our new guests share just a portion of their story. You've been around for, 20-something years, I guess, right?
20 plus about 60.
So just share a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, we just moved out. First time on the East Coast for us. We're Westerners. My wife and I were born in North Dakota, raised in Montana. Lived, apart from a few years in Ontario, we lived all our life on the West Coast. So new experience to be out here with our children.
Yeah.
Found the Lord when I was a teenager because some neighbor people, I always say, loved me into the kingdom.
Amen. I love that.
Yeah. They just showed kindness and cared, and ultimately our whole family would end up following, but my grandparents who adopted me.
Wow.
But that's a story all in itself.
Sure.
Met a beautiful woman when we were in college and got married. Had a great life together.
That's outstanding. Yeah,
pastoring and teaching primarily, and worked for a part of church organization. So a bit of my history.
Sure. Well, that's outstanding. It's interesting how we, come from all different areas and walks in life. Of course, I grew up on the East Coast here, but have traveled all over the world. And during my ministry years, we've been in Arizona and Wisconsin and all over the different places, spoken places overseas. And it's interesting the journey sometimes that the Lord takes us on, which ultimately kind of leads us to our topic and our understanding today about stories. Stories make up our lives, right? I mean, it is what it is, because we all have different ones. And based on just our short relationship, we've only known each other for just a little while, but based on what I have knowledge of you and your work and your teaching, I want to discuss that today for a little bit. Dr. Allen, the value of a story. We all love a good story, every one of us, and oftentimes when we look at things from a scriptural point of view, the Bible is often referenced as the greatest story ever told.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And the more that we look at that from a not only just historical content, but we break it down from the personal nature, it truly is an amazing story. If we turn to Jesus, without a doubt, I believe that we can say he's a master storyteller. The parables and the illustrations and all the stuff. So Jesus used those parables to give profound spiritual truths, but in a relatable way.
Yes.
That was the way that I get it, and that's the way that I teach, and that's how, much like what you said, that someone loved you into the kingdom. That's how I got to understand it. Because I grew up in church, but it never really worked, and that seems strange to a degree. But once you begin to step outside of that realm and look back in, then you get it. Because if it's not relatable, much like telling a story, you either get someone's attention or you lose them.
Yep.
And it usually happens relatively quickly within the first little bit. So we read in Matthew 13 that he spoke in parables, which is another way of saying he told stories.
Yes.
Now, stories make complex ideas understandable and memorable. And I think that's important because we know that oftentimes great stories are told over and over and over all throughout time. So why is this still valid today when we're trying to reach others with the gospel?
When you first told me the subject, the first thought that came to my mind almost immediately was C.S. Lewis,
Absolutely.
The Chronicles of Narnia,
Yes.
and Paul Bunyan's famous book, Pilgrim's Progress,
Yes.
and the power of a story. Immediately those two flashed into my
I love
mind,
that.
and the way in which they related just to people where they live. When I think of the parables, which you're speaking about, I think I mentioned this to you the other day, but when I was teaching the Gospels class, we'd come to the parables. I would always tell my students, sometimes us preachers have a tendency to tear the parables apart and look for every little twist and turn. And I always reminded them that Jesus was simply trying to convey one simple truth in a manner that they would understand because it came out of their cultural milieu.
Mm-hmm.
And that one simple truth, if they can find that, they really found the heart of that parable.
Absolutely.
We murder it, but Jesus didn't. And in their culture, they understood it.
Absolutely.
And that, I think, is the beauty of the parable. It's a simple truth in an understandable way.
Well, that's it. You know, again, when we think about that, being understandable, that ultimately makes it relatable.
Yes.
Because when we're trying to connect with people, you know, especially again, we're thinking of reaching others with the gospel, and the beauty of that. And we go back to what you said about how you came to the Lord, being loved into the kingdom. We typically, in the idea of telling stories, we equate that with taking time.
Yes.
And oftentimes, whether it's from a parental thing, you know, raising our kids or maybe grandkids or whatever, we take the time to share things with them that's important to us. How does that relate to reaching people, whether it's through ministering from a pulpit or sitting in a classroom or just sitting around a table in a small group in your house around a cup of coffee or something? How does this story matter in gluing that together?
First, your earlier comment, the Holy Spirit, I think, Pastor Andy, sometimes just moves, and there's times you can just instantly and quickly move into a situation that's very productive. But most of the time, even in ministry, I think you have to first earn the right to be heard.
Yes.
And that takes time.
It does.
And it also takes sharing of life.
Mm-hmm.
Your stories comes in, life stories, your own personal pilgrimages.
Mm-hmm.
But you earn the right to share. And that often comes by your sharing and your being willing to be open with your experiences. It begins to generate back a response from the other person that has meaning. I think that's more often the pattern than these quick interjectory things. They can happen, but...
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that we find that in the manner that Jesus approached telling stories. So he would enter into that conversation that was already taking place.
Yes.
And be able to build on the situation or the circumstance or whatever that was going on. And so in that we see, especially in ministry, as opportunities to connect with others that otherwise we may not.
Yep.
You know, I think of, and maybe we can build off of this just for a little bit, you know, when we look at, especially some of the more well-known stories, The Woman at the Well and some of the different ones, what we find in that is Jesus approached that by finding something they had in common.
Yep.
You know, like the woman at the well, he started the conversation off by talking about water. It wasn't about spiritual matters or salvation matters. It was about, we're both here for the same reason. Yep. Is that still valuable right now?
Yeah, I think maybe more now than ever, because people have a tendency to be more isolated now than when we were young. So I think what you're saying is even more true than might have been in the past. My first pastorate, Andy, I was just a young preacher. I was out in the rural church. I used to carry my coveralls in the trunk, go help pull a calf or jump on the tractor.
That's right.
Those things spoke more than my words initially.
Oh, yeah.
That I was willing to be involved, go out and help.
Absolutely. No, I think when others can see us from a relatable,
Yes.
we talked about that. I think again the story as it's building for our own lives, whether it's our ministry, our testimony, our witness, what have you, it is building that trust, and how
Yes.
we do that is be seen as real.
Yep.
I think that's the disconnect sometimes. Again, not to be critical, but of larger ministries and different ones, is people almost see these folks as unapproachable, almost as character-like, in the sense that I appreciate what they do or whatever, but I can never sit down and have a conversation like this with them or whatever. And I think sometimes that creates a divide that doesn't allow that relational value of something that could really help someone grow. And I believe that what we find in the ministry of Christ, what's so amazing is we're not just talking about a biblical figure or character. We're talking about the creator of all sat down with his creation.
Yep.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
When we think about the beauty of that, of finding those experiences and different stuff, of course we are told in Scripture that we don't have a high priest that doesn't understand. He went through the grief and the strife and all the temptations and all the different things, which again goes back to the word relatable. Now we have one that can say, I've been there.
Yep.
And I have found, and I'm sure that you did, maybe you can share on this in your multiple years of ministry, those, you mentioned carrying your coveralls in your car. I remember my first church, it was an eye-opening experience, because of course I obviously had no experience at all in that. I was brand new in the ministry, and I'd probably been there, I don't know, no more than a week or two, brand new. And this lady came up to me with a piece of paper, and it had a list of names on there, and I saw my name on that list too. And I'm like, okay, so what is it? She said, it's the cleaning schedule for the church. She said, nobody's exempt here. I'm like, okay. but it was interesting. But when we find that we can speak to people, when we can speak to them through our own experiences, which again, you mentioned that kind of the power of our story. Do you find that helps open more doors?
Very much. I would think, looking back over many, especially with students, I'm sure with anybody, I think of the years of teaching, the more I was willing to open up about my own life,
Yeah,
the quicker I got response from about their life.
absolutely.
It made a world of difference if they saw me as a human being, not as a teacher,
Yes.
as a person that was interested in life and in them, and willing to share my weaknesses, my faults, as well as good things I might want to say in any given conversation. But that probably was the biggest door opener I ever found. It was just me willing to say, here's me.
I found, and I agree with you 100%, over the years that I've been doing this now, there is something just powerful about that personal connection.
Yes.
Because when a person sees you as not only non-approachable, but so far out of my circle that there's no way you can relate to my issue, my struggle, my brokenness, whatever. Our journey oftentimes, in the manners of which not only maybe how we were raised or how we came to faith or different stuff, it changes that conversation. If we're like you said, if we're transparent and
Yes.
relatable, if we come across as, again, and you hate to use some words, but arrogant or unapproachable, or I'm way up here and you're way down there type thing, well, you don't connect with anybody.
Yep.
And I believe that understanding the physical presence of Christ walking the earth, it changes the story of God, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
How do you think that is helpful in getting people to perceive the understanding and notion of God actually being real? Is being able to articulate the fact that he walked here?
I think to some degree, a lot of it's theory. initially.
Right.
It's Bible. It's
Yeah.
history. A man lived. He may even accept him for who he is, but still, in distance, it's history. I think until you in some way, or you or somebody that they know or trust or enters their lives, begins to relate in an understandable and meaningful way, and they begin to see Christianity lived out. I don't know how it ever becomes real until that.
No, I agree.
Somewhere it's got to be seen. It's got to be lived.
Yeah.
Now, the Holy Spirit can do things. I'm not underestimating that at all.
Right.
But usually it comes by people, or touched by other people in some meaningful way.
Absolutely. And I think there again, that's where we get into the personal nature of the story. When we can take the pain of our story and allow it to help someone else. And again, that pain may not be, we may have not gone through this or that, but when we can be relatable to another who is dealing with a struggle, okay? It's like, I cannot personally sit with someone who is battling addiction and say, I know how you feel.
Yep.
Because I've never been through that.
Yep.
However, my 13 years of law enforcement allows me to see the brokenness of that, the realness of that is a destructive lifestyle. It is destructive to the individual, to the family, to all of it. And so I can relate through that avenue that I've seen what it does. I can't say that I've ever dealt with it, but but again, dealing with maybe someone who's gone through a struggle, a broken home, maybe someone who's, you mentioned that you were adopted.
Yeah.
Maybe speaking to someone who's either been, or like I can speak to the parent who is going into that, because we're adoptive parents. Yep. I think being able to be that open book there's still great value in that. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I agree. I was also thinking it's a two-way street. Somewhere, and we're not good at this naturally, most of us aren't, but to have the art of learning to listen as well as to share.
Goodness, yeah.
And until you share your life, but until you can learn to empathetically hear the story of the other, you'll never enter into a real meaningful experience or dialogue with that person. Well, it's two ways.
100%. And wouldn't you agree? And maybe speak on this, that value alone, at least the perception of not only can you not relate, but you won't listen to my story. Doesn't that hinder not just someone's salvation or faith experience, but it hinders them being a part of what we're trying to do, because they have that perception, whether it's because of media or this or that we either don't care or can't relate. Isn't that a major problem right now?
Yes, and especially for clergy.
Yes, that's what that's really what I'm speaking to.
When I was just a young preacher, my first church, we had two beautiful ladies, beautiful Christian wives. I mean, they were nice ladies, but Christian, a character, beautiful, very beautiful young ladies who married a couple of the guys in our church. And they were both out of a Lutheran family, which I've been a Norwegian, I have a Lutheran background as well. So, and we lived in a Norwegian area, and German mixed. There's a lot of Lutheranism there. So nothing negative here.
Right.
In fact, what I'm going to say now is almost a plus to them. But we were invited to her parents' home one day for Thanksgiving one time. And the lady had crumbled the crust on the pie. And she was embarrassed, he told her daughter, to serve it to us because we were the pastor. They had that high of a respect, to their credit, for the role of pastor. Wow. But at the same time, it was a barrier. That barrier had to be broken down if you were going to enter into a more personal and a warm kind of relationship.
I understand that completely.
But it's just a good example of needing to build those bridges.
It really is, because again, I think some people are again wrongly to a degree. While again, I agree with you that we certainly want to be respected or what have you, but I never want that to be a stumbling block that you can't talk to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I maybe you've experienced this over the years, but especially if you live in local and rural communities, you tend to see people out in real life
Yep.
You know, and again, it's not about a condemning thing about however people live, but I have over the years found it comical at times to be like in the grocery store, you know, and someone see you coming down the aisle and they're coming down the aisle and they've got a 6-pack of beer or something in their buggy and they get all like, you know, and it's like, I'm just a guy just like you. I mean, it's not my job. What you do at home is none of my business, you know. But they seem to get really, really worried about that. Friends, we're going to take our first break, and we'll be right back with the next part of Coffee with the Pastor. Welcome back, everybody, to Coffee with the Pastor. We're glad to be here. Speaking to Dr. Alan Solheim today. Been really enjoying getting to know him as he's now a part of the fellowship that I have here at West Fayetteville Baptist and pastoring. And you know, again, he's been around a little bit longer than me. But I have grown to have a great respect of his history and the work that he has done over the years in ministry and meeting people. But one of the things, the values that we share greatly together, even with our age differences and experience differences, is our value of the story, and that's what we're talking about today. Is why that matters. Not just the content of the story, but how it's presented. Yes. Not just the reality of the story, but how it's relatable. Because there's still great value in that. Oftentimes, our stories take us back. Sometimes we have great reflections, and sometimes reflections can be painful. Sometimes they can be joyous. You know, we all have different stories, you know, from our lives. Again, that we talked about in the first segment about being transparent and sharing. You know, I think of great joys of like fishing with my grandfather. You know, that's like one of the favorite things I love to talk about, that are going to the wrestling matches with my dad, you know, those bonding moments. But then, you know, sometimes I think of, you know, 4 years ago, my sister passed away. You know, those are hurtful, painful, sorrowful stories. But and sometimes they're less than a fulfilling memory. But what is the value of taking the time to search for God's faithfulness during the course of our lives, even when we know or we didn't think that He was there?
That's a good question. How could you not at times reflect back? You live a number of years. Good things, bad things happen. But you begin to see the hand of God weaving through all of that. And like one of the Gaither songs talks about, if we hadn't had trials, we'd never know how to handle them.
Absolutely.
Sometimes, I've often said to the class when I was teaching, living in the mountains, and I grew up in the mountains and spent most of my life in the mountains, backpack all the time. They're great. They're a wonderful place to be. But in the winter, there's no life up there. The deer leave, everything leaves.
That's just true.
It's barren. And you don't really grow on a mountain,
Right.
a mountaintop. It's
Wow.
down in the valley where real growth takes place in most of our lives. The others are great times of rejoicing, and they're wonderful, but that's not where most of life develops.
Wow.
It's really
That's
down in the valley. And I think, yeah, if we don't see God in that, and we need to see God more so, I think, even in the valley than the mountaintop.
Man, that's a great analogy, you know, and a lot of people don't see it that way. They see the mountaintop as a success. I finally made it, but I think the problem, obviously not every time, and we don't want to stereotype, but I think sometimes the problem with the mountaintop is I've got it, I've made it, I've reached the crest now. I don't need God. So I'm not looking for God because I got it. And that, whereas like you said, down in the valley, that's where you're working. You're working to keep looking up to get there. You know, again, reflection. I think sometimes you're right. We have to stop and look back, even in the times that we maybe in our own personal lives we're not living for God or following God, and we're thinking, well, you know, there couldn't be any value in that, but there's so much there that we realize that God does have a plan for our life, even when we don't think so, or maybe we're not even aware of that understanding. I believe that God has a value and purpose for every single one of us. We don't always follow that, and we sometimes go on our own way. Like you said, maybe we get to the top of the mountain and forget everything else, and we try to stay there.
Yep. We try.
Yeah, and I think you're right in that can be a very barren and lonely place. There's even, obviously there's cliches about, it's lonely at the top and all this other stuff. There's a lot of truth to that as well. I look back over my life and think, even as a young person, you didn't see it then, obviously at all. Whether it's childlike stuff or even as a young adult, not living for God. But I think back. We were coming home as a family one time. Myself, my sister, and my mom, and my dad was of course at work, and we were crossing the river that goes to our house where my mom and dad still live to this day, and we were just driving along in the car, and just living life, singing songs, doing whatever we were doing. I can't remember. I was like 9 years old, and all of a sudden I looked over and realized my mom was passed out. She was having a seizure. I had no idea what to do. The car is headed to the guardrail of the bridge and we're going over. To this day, I can't tell you, other than now looking back at it, it was the hand of God that I was able to grab the wheel of that car, turn it to the right hand and get it to stop crossways of a major highway. Nobody else was coming. Was able to get the transmission rammed up into park to stop us from going over into the river. And I look back on that now, and that was over 40 years ago, a long time ago. And I look back at things like that now and say, wow, he really was there. How important is it for us? We talk about reflection to not just necessarily even our own lives, but to help others realize God's always been there with you.
Yeah. Going back to the mountain thing just for a moment, Andy.
Absolutely.
People who always at least portray they're on the mountaintop may gain respect. People may say, I wish I could be like that, or I admire that you've reached it. But I don't think very much relational type things happen outside of admiration, maybe.
Right.
But when the crisis of life comes, it's to the person that you'll turn that can say, I care. I found in ministry, sometimes words were the worst thing to use. Sometimes, especially grieving and death, just to be there in a hospital room, and just to be there, period.
Yeah.
And if they want to talk, you talk. If they don't, you don't have to.
That's right.
You're just there.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's said more than 1,000 words would ever say.
I could not agree more.
I remember in my clinical training, I had one of the psychologists on our team would bring a patient in, and he would, in the course of the dialogue, whatever he was doing, he'd bring it to a point where something was thrown at them, a question or in the dialogue, and if they didn't answer, he would never pick up. He'd sit there for even 45 minutes and wait for them to answer.
Oh, wow.
And it was effective. That silence ultimately began to wear away, and the person would finally react. But it isn't always verbiage.
Right.
It's just presence.
Oh, you're right.
And when it is verbiage, the story, back to where we started, it's the reality of my life. It's the relational things that begin to touch, not lots of theory. And I don't mean this wrongly. You're a pastor, so I'm not throwing a bunch of Bible verses. That's not the answer.
It's not the answer.
It's my understanding of you and you of me, and then to interject appropriate at times.
Absolutely.
But you've got to gain that door and that respect and the right to share.
You do, because if you come across, again, overly biblical or spiritual or whatever the case, and again, we're not denigrating that in any way,
not at all,
because there's value in those lessons. But I think just as we learn through the words and the actions more so of Christ, there's not only appropriate time and place for that, but using it in the way that it was meant to be used. I love what you said earlier in the first segment of, those, and again, this is not about finding criticism with anybody, but those that try to tear those things apart word by word to say, what's the deeper, sometimes there's not. Sometimes it's just put yourself in this position and let's see what you see. And I think what you said, especially dealing with people in grief, whether it's the loss of a loved one, maybe it's facing a tragedy of some sort, whether it's financial or we were just together, in a Bible study recently that we just did, and there was a lady there asking for prayer for someone that's getting ready to go through a divorce. I mean, there's just tragedies. Sometimes you're right. Just knowing I can pick up the phone and call, and they'll just come be here, or I can let them know, and that has so much greater value than. And I caution people, especially like in the loss of a loved one, whether it's a spouse or a child or whatever. I caution people, and I know that it's well-meaning, but do not go in and say, "I know how you feel."
Yep.
Don't do that.
Yep.
Because oftentimes you just built a wall. Because now they may be still grieving, but now they're kind of angry because their first inclination is you have absolutely no idea.
Yeah, you've built distance, not a bridge.
Right. So I think I don't think we can really stress enough the efforts that we should make, and this particularly goes to the pastors that are listening to our show. Be relatable.
Yes, very much, and don't have all the answers.
Exactly.
I think that's really a big one.
Oh, it is. It is. I find, and again, this is just my own personal pet peeve or whatever. I find that those who attempt to do that don't come across as helpful. They come across as arrogant.
Very much. And I learned over the years, one question, if I'm asked, why? I never answer. In fact, here's my answer. I never ask why or want to answer the question, why did this happen? It's a very minor thing. Why did my bank book not balance? I mean, that's something you can work through. But right. I'm talking about life's issues. Yeah. Why has no answers? We'll never know the why. No. So then I always kind of turn and say, why don't we ask what? What good can come out of this? What can I do to change it? What can I do to use this in some meaningful way? Mm-hmm. What can God do through this with me and for me? That has answers. Yes, the why will never have an answer till eternity, maybe. But
you're exactly right. That's a beautiful point, because many people, they not only get stuck at why, they move in. They take up residence at why, and they never get out. It's a trap.
Yeah, it is. And to say to someone, well, God just thinks you're a big enough person to handle it. There's no comfort in those kinds of that kind of verbiage.
No.
Rather, just, I don't know, but I know I care and God cares, and I want you to know that I care. I think it'll be far more bridge building than
absolutely.
I have some biblical answer to everything in life, because I don't have.
No, well, I think that's the key in effective ministry. When we look at it again, broad spectrum, beyond the pulpit time on Sunday morning. Okay, that's beautiful. That's a good thing, and that can be relatable if it's done the right way. That can also be very divisive if it's not.
Yeah.
But I think in relating to the individual, and getting one to understand, we don't have all the answers. No. We can have all the training and all the degrees and all the everything like that, but at the same time, God's ways, as Scripture says, are not our ways. We don't always know why. And I think to admit that is a huge open door, because that's helpful.
Yeah. I shared this with you before, Andy. I'll share it for the sake of your audience. But when I went in clinical training, my advisor, who I learned to be I have a sermon I think I preached with 3 or 4 most influential people in my life. Theologically, he and I were worlds apart. He was out of a liberal denomination. I'm a conservative kind of person. A lot of things were different. Mm-hmm. We didn't agree. We wouldn't have agreed on theology.
Right.
Yet he was one of the most influential people in my life. Mm-hmm. But I remember the day he said to me, "Alan, I've never known anybody in all my life who knows how to use the Bible better than you do to keep people away from you."
Wow.
That was an eye-opener, and it was true.
Yeah.
I could throw a verse for anything to protect myself, to have the answer.
Yeah.
I knew the answers in my head.
Right.
But it was after that wall came crumbling down,
Yeah.
you begin to learn relational things and how important they really are, and the difference in just relating to people versus intellectual answers for everything.
Well, I think that is vital in effective ministry. You know, we can kind of turn the points of what we're moving now into the latter parts of the show of being effectual.
Yes.
You know, we want to obviously try to provide sound biblical teaching in at least to the best of our abilities and understandings. But I think sometimes that gets really, really clouded, much like you mentioned with, even though this person was very influential in your life,
Yep.
you found yourself worlds apart in the understanding of everything.
Yes.
And I think that as we are blessed and granted the opportunity to minister to people, especially in the pastorate, finding and shepherding our flock is vital. And oftentimes those look different in different manners. You know, we have different people coming looking for different things. And I know for me, having started in ministry later in life, having come to salvation later in life, I mean, I was nearly 30 years old before that count. I think I was 28 or 29. Familiar at best up until that point, having a, I guess, quote unquote, belief in that I always believed, because we were taught that, you know, that God existed as far as that was concerned. I never understood the relatable value of that. And I think that's still a problem for a lot of people. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, very much. I was just thinking of I had one particular man in mind, but some pastors I've known over many, many years of ministry. There's been 2 or 3 of them that I would say were lousy preachers.
Right.
Their sermons, you almost had to endure them.
Yeah.
But they had successful pastorates because they loved people. And
Right.
they broke down barriers. They pastored.
Right.
They were there in people's needs and crises of life, and they visited and cared. And they were highly successful. And people tolerated the sermon because of the ministry that they had.
Yeah.
And that was far more important than the words they said.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that we find that even in the commissioning of the disciples and different ones that Jesus sent out, it was never about necessarily as much about what you say as how you say
Yes.
it. It was about, obviously you want to be true and right as much as you possibly have the ability to be, but it was about how are you meeting people? Where are you meeting people? Because, you know, as we read through the story of the disciples, they didn't really get that to start off with. They were more concerned about the success, if you want to use that word, and the moving forward than they were taking the time. Because sometimes taking time, well, then my list of things that I need to get done today, just, you know, I'm not going to be able to get it all done because I ran out of time. But if you accomplish that one thing, that one soul that you met, or that one person that, you know, their life was changed because you took that hour or 2 hours or whatever with them, I agree with you. There's much more value in that than it is about, oh, look, I got everything done today. Because sometimes we get so programmatic about everything we got. It's just like, and I established this when I first came to our church. And again, I don't decry anybody's methodology, how they do things. That's their business. But when I first came in, they kind of gave me the format of, this is the way we've always done it. And I'm like, but I don't do it that way because I don't want it to seem programmed. I don't want it to seem like it's all about the bullet point and I got to get everyone. It's not about that. You know, and I think because, again, and you having been in the ministry for so long, that once you establish that you're not relatable, I think you lose your audience right to start off.
Very much. I had to smile just for a moment what you said about programming. I used to say to the class sometimes, people from the evangelical side of Christendom are quick to condemn liturgical type churches because of their liturgical practices. But we do the same thing, exactly the same every week. We have our own liturgical pattern.
Yep.
It just isn't out of a book, but I could go down with hymns, offering, whatever.
No, I agree.
Every week, it's exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference?
No, it's not. There's not. I mean, again, no disrespect whatsoever.
No.
But I could show you a bulletin right now from where some people that I know go to church right now. I can show you one from today, and I can show you one from 40 years ago. And outside of the message title and the prayer list, there's no difference.
No.
It is like point 1, point 2, point 3, stand up, sit down, sing this song, do this prelude, pray this prayer. And again, I'm not saying that to be critical, but it's you're right. You're right. But I find that if we are taking a conscious about and aware of the fact that Jesus met people, again, we go back to that point where they were.
Exactly.
And if that meant taking the time to sit there with them, or if that meant, talking about whatever, that's what happened. And I find when I'm writing and preparing, I'm doing it with that in mind. We've got the story laid out that I want to tell, but if we find that one point has greater value, or we find that one section of Scripture has greater value, and we need to spend more time there, then so be it. Sure. Friends, we're going to take our next break. We'll be right back with the final part of Coffee with the Pastor. Welcome back, everybody, to Coffee with the Pastor. Glad to be here with you, and glad to be with our special guest today, Dr. Alan Solheim. We're having a great conversation about storytelling. He and I both, while again, a couple of years between us, but we still have a love for the art of the story. Pastor, the stories of the Bible, they become generational.
Oh, very much.
I mean, we got Noah and the Ark and Daniel in the lion's den and all these different ones. But not only are they're generational in the sense that we've heard them our whole lives. I would even say to some degree, even in secular homes, these stories become themes sometimes. People have their nurseries done in Noah's theme and different. So when we hold these stories, we've heard these stories our whole lives, and those that before us, they told them and they've passed them down. Why are these accounts not just popular, but why are they impactful?
I think one, because they're real life, people that lived experience.
That's it.
They're not just so much of the Bible can be theory if you let it be that.
Yes.
These stories are hard to be theory.
Right.
They're stories.
Yeah.
But I think, Pastor Andy, even there, how we deal with them and present them can make a world of difference still.
100%.
The books I wrote, I've tried to do that, to personalize them, to bring feelings and emotions into it, and not just story.
Absolutely.
Or history.
Yeah.
It's more than that. They're people's lives.
That's
and whatever we do, we can catch the life that was lived and enter into that life emotionally, if we try, where it's going to come alive.
Well, I agree. I think when we understand the relatable nature, when you can, and much like what you mentioned, and I love your style of writing from first person, in that you put yourself in that situation, you put yourself in that life that's being led, or in that circumstance, or whatever, and we think about that, and I think about, like, one of the ones that just jumped out to me as I was preparing for the show was David and Goliath. All right, that is a life situational story that not only sees two combatants there, of one of greater enormity than the other and one of greater strength and everything like that, but it becomes relatable when we do see it as that insurmountable odds, that impossible situation. Okay, few of us in this life may ever actually face a real giant, in the sense of a 10-foot tall man. Most of us are never going to do that. I had the fortune in my life of meeting a couple of giants for real, Andre the Giant from the wrestling world, and some different enormous human beings thankfully was never on the receiving end of anything bad from that. But when we look at it from the perspective of facing that mountain, facing that insurmountable odds that seemingly on the surface is impossible. I'm going to lose. I'm going to get beat up or hurt or whatever. And then we see David's not just strength and precision with his ability to slay that giant, but the confidence he had because of his faith in God.
Yes.
To me, that speaks to the person that is wrestling their giant, whatever their giant may be. And so knowing and accepting that these stories, like you mentioned, are not just real. You know, that these involve real people. I think even in today's world, even possibly from secular works or whatever, when we look at crime stories, you know, maybe the person that is in an abusive situation, but they've never told anybody, but they read an account or they hear a news story or whatever of someone who's going through that, they don't feel alone anymore. That like I can relate to that. Isn't that important that we share these things? Even because oftentimes I go back and preach from these very same stories that have been turned into almost children's accounts and very, very simplistic in version. But if we not overly complicated or overly biblicize it, if I can make up a word, but look at it from the, like you said, from the first person perspective of like, wow, this really actually has so much. I just recently did a series. It was before you came on Jonah, and while we have the very, very childlike Jonah in the whale story, that's a massive account of God's heart of wanting to bring salvation to the people of Nineveh, and it spoke volumes of Jonah's perception in that. So those stories still have value now. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, very much. Let's go back to David and Goliath for a moment. I happened to be reading the story I wrote about him this morning in Goliath, interestingly enough.
Wow.
But what stuck out of my mind was David had to be a teenager. People were sent into the army at age 20 in those days, and he wasn't in the army yet. His brothers were. So he was under 20.
This is
so
right.
let's say late teens. To realize that, can you imagine how powerful that can be when you're dealing with a teenager and the struggles of teenage years?
Wow.
To use David as one who experienced life at their age, and look what God can do through a life as a teenager.
Oh, that's powerful. Yeah.
A way of applying some of this storytelling.
I agree. No, and it is. And again, it's amazing. You know, over the years, I've seen different abilities and ways to do that. Whether it's through an old biblical account or whether it's through an old hymn. You know, sometimes we lose the value of words over time because society says it's outdated or out of touch or whatever the case. But I remember it's been many years ago, but I was playing music on a Sunday morning. Had just taken that Sunday as a day to do that, and I enjoy that from time to time. And I did all the several of the old classics, and just a little more upbeat, a little more, you know, whatever. But everything was there. And I remember some young people, and you mentioned under 20, and all of these were. They came up and they said, "Pastor, man, I really enjoyed that." First and foremost, they said, "I didn't know you could do that." But then they said, "Where did that song come from?" Well, those were awesome words. Those were cool words, you know, to be in young terminology. I'm like, well, the particular one that you're so enamored with is about 200 years old. I mean, it's like, and so when we think about these stories, the key to good storytelling, as we look at finishing up our time together, the key to good storytelling is the ability to connect with the audience.
Yes,
we know that without a question, but to connect with a listening audience, okay? Because they don't listen to us, the story doesn't. It kind of falls flat, right? That's whether you're storytelling or being a stand-up comedian or you've got to be able to connect with them, or singing a song. So as we share the love of Christ, and we share the value of knowing Him. Why, Pastor Allen, why does the story matter when it comes to reaching people for Christ? And we'll finish on this.
I think back to what we said a few moments ago. It's either theory or life, or theory or reality. If we just present it as theory, it's biblical content, it's history, it's something that we admire, but it's not relatable. It's not going to really touch the soul alive. Whatever degree you begin to personalize that, you see it lived out in a life, or the story touches an emotional need in some way that's relatable. I think it's only then it becomes alive. Other than that, it's just history.
That's right.
Bible.
That's right.
Church.
Yeah.
It's not life.
I agree, and I think that's where I know. Again, we have all different types of, when it comes to opinions and feelings and whatever the case, about how things are presented. But I have learned, and that's one of the things that I truly value, not only from your experience but your feeling and opinion of the art of the story. Because I think sometimes not only do we disengage our audience with just the presentation of whether it's historical fact or our great deep theological knowledge or how many words that we know. And I'm not finding that any of that doesn't have value, because obviously there's times and places for that. But for me, the ability to connect, to be able to maintain an audience's attention for 30 minutes or whatever the case may be, or like on a show like this for an hour, that there is not only a some nominal amount of talent in that, but it is understanding the heart of your listener.
Oh, yes.
If you don't connect with that, then you're right. You're. I would even say that even you were a teacher, you were a professor. I would say that goes into the classroom as well. I remember as a young person in school, if the teacher not only had real passion about what they were teaching, but they had relatability to the student, you tended not only to listen more, but you learned something.
I think out of the clinical training helped me with my next statement. I mean, it had an influence on me. But sometimes I tell students that were potential pastors, if you're going to learn to be a pastor, learn to read your audience.
Yes.
Number one, don't just assume I have something to share and I'm going to share it. Learn to read your audience.
Yeah.
Very important. And I think number two, the most important part of the sermon is the introduction. If you don't catch them, you don't have them.
No. Well,
Or it takes a long time to get them back.
Oh, no, it's absolutely true. We see that in today, in the modern time of the social media platforms, they call it a hook.
Yep.
If that first 5 seconds or 10 seconds of whatever you're producing, whether it's a video or information like that, that's about how long you've got to garner their attention and how long they will stay with you through the duration of your whatever you're presenting. Whether it's a question, whether it's a quirky or funny comment or something, and even the same way with a song. Yes. Songwriters call it the hook. It's like that first line or something in there that is like, okay, or that first guitar strum, something that says, I want to listen to that. I want to do that. And I think that is valuable, because you're right. Learning your audience is so important. We want to, give forth the text and try to understand it. But I think at least this is something that I've been really working hard to learn and just praying for the Lord's ability to do it. Is not so much be so deeply concerned about the great theological knowledge. Not that there's not value in that, but again, how does that relate to the person that's listening to you? Because if you're talking over their head, or you're just out there somewhere in a different place, you're right. Out of respect or whatever, they're going to tolerate it or listen to it, but they're not getting anything out of it.
And a lot of preaching is indoctrination. It isn't relational.
It is.
It's defending my position, my denomination, my theological position, rather than presenting the simple truth of the gospel.
No, it does. It comes down to, I'm trying to prove to you that I'm right.
Yep.
and I think with that, you lose people. You don't gain people. And Jesus said, teach. I love words. And when Jesus said, teaching them to observe that which I have taught you in the Great Commission, I immediately am drawn to the word observe, because the word observe is visual.
Yep.
He's saying teaching them to observe. In other words, he's saying they're watching you. And what did I teach you? Love God, love one another. Hang everything on those two commands. And so to me, if we get much deeper than that, and get off into the weeds about, again, proving my point or my position or this, then I'm not teaching you to observe what God said, and then I'm not really fulfilling my job as equipping the saints.
Yep.
I think that's important. And again, it's not to dumb things down or to oversimplify, but then again, all the stories that Jesus told and all the accounts. I just mentioned this recently in a message of I don't remember if it was on a Sunday or Wednesday, but we were talking about a particular scenario, and I asked the question, why does this sound familiar? Because it's life. It's the ups and downs and the joys and the sadnesses. I mean, because that's what's being shown to us there. So, well, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been a real joy, and I pray that everybody that's listening has not only enjoyed our time together, but it's caused them to say, okay, I got a little bit different perspective of how things are maybe need to work. That's a wrap for us this week as far as the show is concerned. I pray that what we've offered you has been a blessing to you. The value of the story, it truly has the ability to connect lives in so many different ways. I want to thank our special guest, Dr. Alan Solheim, for taking time to be with us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Would love to have you back sometime. I'm honored that you're here. Appreciate your input on the topic today, because you value this. And,
Yes.
and that is something that's important to me. Sometimes we can connect with fellow pastors because of differences over this or that, or maybe similarities, but I think when there's a heart connection, there's just something, and the passion that you have for this is so important. To all of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. To all of our fellow pastors, knowledge is great, but connection is priceless.
Yes.
Learn to tell the story. Friends, that's it for us today. Until next week, I am your host, Pastor Andy. This is Coffee with the Pastor, where Jesus is good all the way to the last drop.
You've been listening to Coffee with the Pastor with your host, Andy McDaniel. Connect and learn more when you visit the podcast page at Christian1057.com. And join us each week for Coffee with the Pastor on Christian 105.7.